I thought the worst part was over after David's funeral. Standing there in my black dress, watching them lower my husband of 10 years into the ground, I believed I had faced the hardest moment of my life. Our beautiful $800,000 home in the suburbs felt empty without his laughter echoing through the halls. We had plans. So many plans. The nursery we never got to decorate, the family vacations we'd mapped out, the future that died with him at 39 from a sudden heart attack. David always said, "Family first." It was his motto, printed on a little plaque in our kitchen, something he'd repeat whenever I got frustrated with his sister Melissa's constant need for help. She was a single mom to baby Connor, and David felt responsible for her ever since their parents passed. "Family first, Rachel," he'd say, kissing my forehead. "We take care of our own." I never questioned it. I never questioned him. Even when he started spending more and more time at Melissa's house, helping with Connor, fixing things around her apartment, being the father figure that little boy needed, David had such a big heart. It's what made me fall in love with him in the first place. But now, sitting in our living room a week after his funeral, staring at the sympathy cards covering our coffee table, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that something was off. Do you ever completely trust your spouse? Like completely? Because I thought I did. The first crack in my perfect world started 3 months before David died. He'd been going to Melissa's place almost every evening after work. "Connor's teething," he'd explain. "Melissa needs the help. You know how stressed she gets." I'd nod and smile, heat up his dinner for when he got home around 10 p.m., and try to ignore the knot in my stomach. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the stress of trying to conceive for 2 years without success. I know you've felt it too, that uncomfortable feeling when your partner seems more invested in someone else's problems than your own. The way David's eyes would light up when Melissa called, how he'd drop everything to rush over there. But I pushed those thoughts away. He was being a good brother. That's all. Until I found the text messages. It was a Tuesday night, 2 weeks before his heart attack. David had left his phone on the nightstand while he showered, and it kept buzzing. I glanced over, expecting work emails, but saw Melissa's name lighting up the screen. The preview showed just enough to make my blood run cold. The blood test results came back positive. "We need to talk about what this means for Connor and—" The bathroom door opened before I could read more, but that fragment burned itself into my brain. Blood test results? What blood test? And why would it concern Connor? But then David collapsed at his office the next week, and all my questions got buried under funeral arrangements and grief. At the service, I watched Melissa sob like she'd lost her husband instead of her brother. She clung to baby Connor, whispering, "Daddy's gone, baby, Daddy's gone." I thought it was just her way of grieving, helping Connor understand that his uncle wouldn't be visiting anymore. I was so naive. 1 week later, Melissa called about Connor's first birthday party. "I know you're still grieving," she said, her voice unusually gentle, "but Connor needs his family around him. David would want you there." She was right, of course. David adored that little boy, always talking about being the best uncle possible. So I dragged myself out of bed, put on a bright yellow dress that David had loved, and drove to Melissa's apartment with a carefully wrapped gift. The moment I walked into that crowded living room, I knew something was wrong. The atmosphere felt charged, electric with anticipation. Melissa kept glancing at me with this strange mixture of pity and excitement. Her friends whispered in corners, shooting me looks I couldn't quite interpret. Even Connor seemed fussier than usual, as if he could sense the tension crackling through the air. But there's something Melissa didn't know about that day. Something that would change everything. After we sang Happy Birthday and Connor smashed his cake into his high chair tray, Melissa stood up in the center of the room. She was holding an envelope in one hand and Connor in the other, and she had that look, you know, the look people get right before they drop a bomb on your life. "Everyone, I have an announcement," she began, her voice carrying clearly over the party chatter. The room fell silent. I've been keeping a secret for Connor's sake, but now that he's a year old, I think it's time for the truth to come out. My stomach clenched. I found myself gripping my plastic cup of punch so hard it started to crack. Connor isn't just David's nephew, Melissa continued, bouncing the baby on her hip. He's David's son, his biological son. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. I felt like someone had punched me in the chest, knocked all the air from my lungs. But Melissa wasn't done. She pulled papers from the envelope, waving them in the air. I have David's will right here. He left specific instructions about Connor's inheritance. Since Connor is his biological child, he's entitled to half of everything, including Rachel's house. The blood drained from my face as she walked over to me, her expression a mask of false sympathy. I'm sorry, Rachel. I know this is hard to hear, but according to this will, Connor has legal claim to half of that $800,000 house. As his mother and legal guardian, I'll be managing his assets until he's 18. She handed me the papers, and I stared down at what looked like an official document. David's signature was at the bottom, clear as day. The date was just 2 weeks before he died. I'm giving you 30 days to make arrangements, Melissa said, her voice getting firmer now, more businesslike. You can buy out Connor's half, or we can sell the house and split the proceeds. But either way, my son deserves what his father left him. The entire room was staring at me, waiting for my reaction. I could hear whispers. Poor Rachel. How terrible. She had no idea. I looked up at Melissa, at this woman I'd considered my sister for 10 years, holding the baby she claimed was my dead husband's child. I should have screamed. I should have collapsed. I should have demanded proof or called my lawyer or caused a scene that would echo through our family forever. Instead, I said, "Oh, I see," and tried to hold back my laughter. Because there was something my husband had told me that Melissa didn't know about, something that made this whole elaborate performance not just wrong, but absolutely hilarious. Do you want to warn me what you think is coming next? The thing is, Melissa had forgotten one crucial detail in her rush to claim her inheritance. She'd forgotten that David and I had no secrets between us. Well, almost no secrets. David had come to me 6 months before he died, tears streaming down his face, and confessed everything. "Rachel, I made a terrible mistake," he'd said, kneeling beside our bed where I was reading. "Melissa and we had a moment of weakness after Mom and Dad's funeral. We were both grieving and we'd had too much wine, and it just happened. Once. Just once, I swear." My heart had shattered that night, but David's honesty, his complete devastating honesty, had also saved us. He told me about the pregnancy scare, about Melissa's initial claims that Connor might be his, about the guilt that was eating him alive. "But Rachel," he'd said, gripping my hands. "I took a paternity test. Connor isn't mine. Melissa knows this. She got the results the same day I did. I don't know why she's been letting everyone believe I'm the father, but I needed you to know the truth." So when Melissa stood there in her living room, waving around her fake will and making her grand announcement, I knew exactly what game she was playing. The question was, did I want to end it immediately, or did I want to let her dig herself a deeper hole? If you were in my position, what would you do? I chose patience. I chose to let Melissa think she'd won, because sometimes the best revenge is letting someone destroy themselves with their own lies. "You know what, Melissa?" I said, folding the fake will and tucking it into my purse. "You're right. Family should take care of family. David always said that." I stood up, smoothed my dress, and gave her my best grieving widow smile. I'll need some time to process all this, of course. It's a lot to take in. The relief on her face was almost comical. She'd expected a fight, tears, maybe even violence. Instead, she was getting compliance. Easy compliance. "Of course," she said quickly. "Take all the time you need. Well, not all the time, but you know what I mean. This is probably a shock." A shock. Right. Over the next few days, I played my part perfectly. I called Melissa crying about lawyers and mortgages. I complained to mutual friends about David's secret child and how betrayed I felt. I even went so far as to suggest we get Connor tested, just to be absolutely sure. That's a great idea, Melissa agreed eagerly. I mean, we already know the results, but it'll give you peace of mind, and it'll make the inheritance process cleaner. What Melissa didn't know was that while she was planning her new life in my house, I was making plans of my own. Plans that involved a certain recording device I'd hidden in David's study 6 months ago, capturing his full confession. Plans that involved emails David had sent to Melissa after our conversation, telling her in no uncertain terms to stop spreading lies about Connor's parentage. Most importantly, plans that involved David's real will, the one he'd made with our family attorney just 2 weeks before he died, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of situation. We all have secrets that others don't pay the price for, don't we? The DNA test results came back on a Thursday. I was sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where David used to say, "Family first," when Melissa called with barely contained excitement. "Rachel, the results are in," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Should I come over? I think we should discuss this in person." "Actually, why don't we meet at your place?" I suggested. "I think Connor should be there for this conversation about his future." An hour later, I knocked on Melissa's door carrying a manila envelope and wearing the same yellow dress I'd worn to Connor's birthday party. Melissa answered immediately, practically bouncing on her toes. Come in," she said, ushering me to her tiny living room. Connor was napping in his crib, blissfully unaware that his entire world was about to shift. Melissa sat across from me, her hands folded in her lap like a child waiting for Christmas presents. "So," she began, "I assume you've seen the results?" I nodded, keeping my expression carefully neutral. "I have. And?" "Well," I said slowly, "you're absolutely right. DNA doesn't lie." Her face broke into a triumphant grin. "I know this is hard for you, Rachel, but Connor deserves to know his father's legacy. He deserves that house, that security. David would want that." "Oh, I'm sure David would want Connor to have everything he deserves," I agreed. Then I opened my manila envelope and pulled out the real DNA test results, which is why I think you should see these. The color drained from Melissa's face as I slid the papers across her coffee table. Her hands trembled as she picked them up, scanning the official letterhead, the laboratory results, the definitive conclusion that would destroy every lie she'd built over the past year. "This can't be right," she whispered. 99.7% certain, I read aloud from the document. "David Morrison is not the biological father of Connor Williams." The paper fluttered from her fingers as she stared at me in shock. But the test I showed you was fake," I said calmly. "A very good fake, I'll admit. Did you make it yourself, or did you pay someone?" Melissa's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "I don't understand. How did I know?" I smiled, the same patient smile I'd been wearing for weeks. "Because David told me everything 6 months ago, Melissa. Everything, including the real paternity test results that proved Connor isn't his son." The truth hit her like a physical blow. She doubled over, clutching her stomach, and for a moment I actually felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the funeral, the birthday party, the weeks of letting me believe my dead husband had betrayed me. Who's the real father, Melissa? She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "James," she whispered. "James Peterson, David's friend from college." James. Of course. I remembered him now. He'd been coming around a lot during the time Connor was conceived, right after David and Melissa's parents died. Another grieving friend, another shoulder to cry on. "Does James know?" I asked. Melissa shook her head. "I told him the baby wasn't his. I told him it was David's because David had a house, had money, had stability. James was still struggling, still trying to get his business off the ground. I thought Connor would be better off with David as his father. Have you ever watched someone's entire world crumble in real time? It's more devastating than you'd think, even when they deserve it. But Melissa wasn't finished destroying herself yet. "Please," she begged, reaching for my hands. "Please don't tell James. Don't tell anyone. Connor thinks David is his father. Everyone thinks David is his father. We can just forget about the house. I'll tear up the will. We can go back to how things were." I pulled my hands away. "We can't go back, Melissa. You made sure of that when you decided to humiliate me at your son's birthday party." "I was desperate," she cried. "I'm behind on rent. I can barely afford Connor's daycare," I thought. I thought David would want me to use his name to give Connor a better life. "David's dead," I said quietly. "He can't want anything anymore. But you know what he did want? He wanted you to stop lying about Connor's paternity. He sent you emails, Melissa. Lots of them." Her face went white. "You read his emails?" "I didn't have to. He showed them to me. Every single one where he begged you to tell the truth, to stop letting Connor grow up believing a lie." I stood up, smoothing my dress. David loved that little boy, but he loved honesty more. As I walked toward the door, Melissa called after me. "What are you going to do?" I turned back to look at her. This woman who had been my sister-in-law, my friend, my family for 10 years. This woman who had chosen to build her child's future on a foundation of lies and manipulation. "I'm going to do what David would have wanted," I said. "I'm going to make sure Connor knows the truth about his real father. James deserves to know he has a son, and Connor deserves to know his real heritage." "And the house?" she whispered. I smiled, and this time it wasn't patient or kind. "The house was never yours to claim, Melissa. David's real will leaves everything to me, with a trust fund for Connor's education, assuming his real father wants to be involved in managing it." The last thing I heard as I closed the door was Melissa's broken sob and Connor's cry as he woke from his nap, but I didn't look back. Some bridges, once burned, aren't meant to be rebuilt. But even as I walked to my car, I knew this wasn't over. Melissa was cornered now, desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things. The DNA test results would destroy her story, but they'd also expose her to James, to the courts, to everyone who'd believed her lies. What I didn't know was how far she'd go to protect herself or how much collateral damage she'd be willing to accept. Because when someone's entire life is built on a lie, the truth doesn't just set them free, it destroys everything they've ever known. And sometimes destruction makes people unpredictable. The call from my attorney came at 7 a.m., 3 days after I'd left Melissa crying in her apartment. Attorney Williams' voice was tight with concern as he delivered news that should have shocked me, but somehow didn't. "Rachel, Melissa hired a lawyer. She's challenging David's will, claiming fraud and coercion. She's also filed for emergency custody of Connor, stating that James Peterson is an unfit father due to his criminal background, which, by the way, consists of 1 DUI from 15 years ago." I sat in David's chair in our home office, staring at the family photo on his desk. "How long do we have?" "The hearing is set for next week. But Rachel..." Williams paused, and I could hear papers rustling. "There's something else. Melissa's lawyer is claiming you fabricated the DNA evidence. They're demanding a court-ordered test." "Let them," I said calmly. "The truth is the truth." What Williams didn't know, what no one knew except David and me, was that I'd been expecting this exact response. In fact, I'd been counting on it, because Melissa's desperation was about to reveal something much darker than a simple paternity lie, something that would destroy not just her credibility, but her freedom. Do you think I'm being too harsh? Because I'm about to show you just how deep this rabbit hole goes. The courtroom was packed the following Tuesday. Melissa sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Richardson, who specialized in family law and apparently had no problem representing obvious fraudsters. She'd dressed Connor in a tiny suit and kept him on her lap during the proceedings, playing the devoted single mother card for all it was worth. James Peterson sat behind me, his face a mask of confusion and hurt. I'd called him the day after confronting Melissa, and watching him process the news that he had a son who'd been hidden from him for over a year, was heartbreaking. But James was a good man, the kind who owned up to his responsibilities and loved deeply when given the chance. "Your Honor," Richardson began, "my client was coerced into silence about her son's true parentage by David Morrison's threats. Mr. Morrison used his financial superiority to pressure Ms. Williams into allowing him to be listed as the father, then created a fraudulent will to steal inheritance from his biological son." It was a masterful performance, I had to admit. Melissa dabbed her eyes at all the right moments, bounced Connor lovingly, and played the victim with Oscar-worthy skill. If I didn't know better, I might have believed her myself. But then it was our turn. "Your Honor," Attorney Williams stood, holding a thick folder. "The defense would like to present evidence that will conclusively prove Ms. Williams has been perpetrating an elaborate fraud for over 18 months. He opened the folder and pulled out the first document. "This is a paternity test conducted 14 months ago at Ms. Williams' request, conclusively proving that David Morrison was not Connor Williams' biological father." Richardson jumped up. "Objection. That document was obtained illegally." "Actually," Williams smiled, "it was provided voluntarily by Ms. Williams herself to Mr. Morrison, along with this letter." He held up a second document, in which she explicitly acknowledges the test results and asks Mr. Morrison to keep pretending to be Connor's father for financial reasons. I watched Melissa's face go white as her own words were read aloud in court, but Williams wasn't finished. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we have recorded evidence of Mr. Morrison confronting Ms. Williams about this deception just weeks before his death." The bailiff set up a small speaker system, and suddenly David's voice filled the courtroom. It was the conversation I'd secretly recorded in our study 6 months ago, when he'd called Melissa to confront her about the continued lies. "Melissa, you have to stop this. Connor deserves to know his real father, and James deserves to know he has a son. I won't be part of this lie anymore." Melissa's voice came through clearly. "But David, you have money, you have the house. James can barely take care of himself. Connor needs stability. Connor needs the truth. And if you don't tell James within the week, I will." The recording continued for another 10 minutes, with Melissa alternating between begging and threatening, while David remained firm in his decision to expose the truth. When it ended, the courtroom was silent, except for Connor's babbling. Have you ever seen someone realize they've been checkmated? The exact moment when they understand that every move they could make will only make things worse. But the final blow came when Williams called his surprise witness. "Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Jennifer Martinez, Chief Forensic Accountant for Morrison and Associates." I felt a flutter of surprise myself as Dr. Martinez took the stand. I knew her professionally. David's company had used her services for complex fraud cases, but I hadn't expected her to be involved in this. "Dr. Martinez," Williams began, "can you tell the court about your recent investigation into Ms. Williams' financial activities?" "Certainly. 3 months ago, David Morrison contacted me privately, requesting a full audit of his sister-in-law's financial records. He suspected fraud but wanted definitive proof before taking action." She opened her laptop and projected documents onto the courtroom screen. What we discovered was systematic identity theft and financial fraud dating back 2 years. Ms. Williams had been using David Morrison's credit and social security number to obtain loans, credit cards, and even a car lease. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements, loan applications, credit reports, all showing Melissa using David's identity to finance her lifestyle while claiming poverty and single mother hardship. The total amount fraudulently obtained is approximately $47,000. Dr. Martinez concluded. Mr. Morrison was planning to confront Ms. Williams about this the week he died. Suddenly, Melissa's desperate grab for my house made perfect sense. She wasn't just trying to secure Connor's future. She was trying to hide her crimes and pay off debts that David's death had left exposed. Richardson was frantically whispering with his client, but there was nothing left to argue. The evidence was conclusive, devastating, and publicly documented. Furthermore, Your Honor, Williams continued, we have evidence that the will presented by Ms. Williams was fabricated using David Morrison's genuine signature, lifted from one of the fraudulent loan documents she'd forged. Judge Harrison looked down at Melissa with obvious disgust. Ms. Williams, you are hereby ordered to submit to immediate paternity testing for your son, to be conducted by the court's designated laboratory. You are also being referred to the district attorney's office for prosecution on charges of identity theft, fraud, and attempted inheritance theft. As the bailiff approached Melissa's table, she finally broke. Wait, she screamed, clutching Connor to her chest. You don't understand. I did this for him. I did this because James abandoned us. That's not true. James stood up from behind me, his voice carrying across the courtroom. You never told me Connor was mine, Melissa. You told me he was David's and that I needed to stay away from you both. So the judge banged his gavel as Melissa dissolved into hysterics. But I barely heard the noise, because I was finally seeing the full scope of what David had discovered before he died, and why he'd been so determined to protect not just me, but Connor and James from Melissa's web of lies. Do you think justice always feels as satisfying as you expect it to? The aftermath of the court hearing unfolded like dominoes falling in slow motion. Melissa was arrested on the spot, and Connor was placed in emergency custody with James while the paternity results were pending. Though we all knew what they'd show, the news crews that had gathered for what they'd expected to be a simple inheritance dispute found themselves covering a story of fraud, identity theft, and family betrayal. But as I sat in my empty house that night, surrounded by sympathy cards that suddenly felt meaningless, I realized that winning in court hadn't filled the hole that David's death and Melissa's betrayal had torn in my life. If anything, it had made the silence more deafening. My phone rang just after midnight. It was James. Rachel, I'm sorry to call so late, but Connor won't stop crying. He keeps asking for Mama, and I don't know what to do. He doesn't know me at all. I found myself reaching for my car keys before I'd even decided to help. 20 minutes later, I was standing in James's modest apartment, holding a sobbing 1-year-old who'd lost the only mother he'd ever known, regardless of the lies that relationship had been built on. He's scared, I told James as Connor gradually calmed in my arms. Everything he knows has just been turned upside down. James looked exhausted and overwhelmed. The paternity test results won't be back for another week, but I can see it, you know? He has my eyes, my mouth. How could I have missed it? Because you trusted her, I said simply. Because you believed her when she said he wasn't yours. We spent the next hour getting Connor settled, and as I watched James awkwardly but lovingly try to comfort his son, I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. We were all victims of Melissa's lies, even Melissa herself. James, I said as I prepared to leave, David set up a college fund for Connor. Even knowing he wasn't the biological father, he still wanted to make sure Connor would be okay. James's eyes filled with tears. He was a good man. Yes, he was. And he'd want Connor to grow up knowing he was loved by everyone who mattered, including the uncle who cared enough to plan for his future. Would you have been able to show that kind of grace? Because what happened next tested every bit of compassion I thought I had. The call came from the county jail 2 weeks later. Melissa wanted to see me, and against every instinct I had, I agreed to the visit. She looked terrible, hollow-eyed, thin, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made her skin look sallow. But what struck me most was how small she seemed, like a child who'd finally been caught in a lie too big to handle. I know you hate me, she said without preamble, speaking through the plexiglass barrier that separated us. I know I deserve it. I don't hate you, Melissa, I said, and was surprised to realize it was true. I'm angry, I'm hurt, I'm disappointed, but I don't hate you. She started crying then, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. I never meant for it to go this far. It started with just one lie, just telling David the baby might be his because I was scared James would run. Then when David wanted the test, I panicked and faked the results because I thought if I could just buy some time, the credit cards, the loans. I was drowning, Rachel. Daycare costs, medical bills, rent. I kept thinking that if I could just get through this month, this payment, this crisis, I'd figure out how to pay it all back. But it just kept getting worse. I studied her face through the scratched plexiglass. And when David died, you saw an opportunity to solve all your problems at once. She nodded miserably. I thought if Connor inherited the house, I could sell it, pay off the debts, start fresh. I convinced myself that David would have wanted Connor to have security, even if he wasn't really his son. But you had to destroy me to get it. I know. Her voice was barely a whisper. I know there's no excuse for what I did to you. You lost your husband, and instead of being there for you, I made everything worse. I'm sorry, Rachel. I'm so sorry. The apology felt genuine, but apologies don't undo damage. What's going to happen to you? My lawyer says probably 2 to 5 years, depending on how many charges stick. Identity theft, fraud, perjury. She wiped her nose on her sleeve. James won't let me see Connor. I don't blame him, but he's my baby, you know? Even with all the lies, I love him. That's when I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Melissa, what if there was another way? She looked up sharply. What do you mean? What if instead of fighting this in appeals and dragging it out for years, you pleaded guilty to the financial crimes, agreed to make restitution, and entered a treatment program? What if James and I worked together to make sure Connor knows who his mother is, even while you're getting the help you need? Hope flickered in her eyes, but she shook her head. Why would you do that, after everything I've done? I thought about David, about his family-first philosophy, about the little boy who was caught in the middle of all our adult failures. Because Connor deserves better than to grow up thinking his mother was a monster. Because James deserves support in raising a child he just found out existed. And because... I paused, surprised by my own words. Because you're still family, Melissa. Broken, damaged family, but family. Do you think forgiveness is weakness or strength? Because I was about to find out. The plan we developed over the following months wasn't perfect, but it was hopeful. Melissa pleaded guilty to the financial crimes and was sentenced to 18 months in minimum security, with mandatory counseling and a restitution plan that would take years to complete, but was manageable. James got full custody of Connor, but we established a supervised visitation program so Connor could maintain a relationship with his mother. I sold the house. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The memories of David were precious, but they didn't need to be tied to a building that had become the center of so much pain and conflict. James, Connor, and I found a smaller place closer to James's work, and we became an unlikely family unit. Connor was too young to understand the complexities of DNA and legal battles, but he understood love. He had James, who read him bedtime stories and taught him to walk. He had me, who had become something like a stepmother or aunt, helping with daycare pickups and doctor visits. And he had Melissa, who called every day and visited every week, working to rebuild trust that her lies had shattered. The trust fund that David had established grew steadily, managed jointly by James and me. By the time Connor turned 2, it was clear that his college education would be fully funded, along with graduate school if he chose. David's final gift to a little boy who wasn't his son but had somehow captured his heart anyway. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" James asked me one evening as we watched Connor play with blocks on the living room floor. "Letting her back into his life?" I considered the question seriously. I think David would approve. He always believed that people could change if they were willing to do the work. Melissa is doing the work. And what about us? James gestured between the 3 of us. This weird little family we've created? I smiled, watching Connor stack blocks with the intense concentration that only toddlers possess. I think David would approve of this too. He always said family first, but I think he meant chosen family, the people who show up for each other when it matters. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. James answered it and returned with a familiar manila envelope. "Connor's updated birth certificate," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's official now. I'm his father." I looked at the document over his shoulder, seeing James Peterson listed as father and Melissa Williams as mother. In the section for additional notes, someone had written, "College fund established by David Morrison, uncle and family friend." Even in death, David had found a way to be part of Connor's official story. That night, after James and Connor had gone to bed in their respective rooms, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and David's old photo album, pictures of our wedding, our vacations, the life we'd built together. But mixed in with those memories were newer photos: Connor's second birthday party, James' graduation from a parenting class, even a supervised visit with Melissa where everyone was actually smiling. The family photos looked different now. Instead of the nuclear family David and I had planned, we'd created something more complex but equally loving, a network of people committed to making sure one little boy grew up knowing he was wanted, protected, and cherished by multiple adults who had learned to work together despite their complicated history. My phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. "Thank you for giving me a second chance. Connor drew me a picture today. It's of all of us together. He's learning that families can be bigger than just one house." I smiled, thinking about Connor's drawing, about David's legacy living on in ways he never could have imagined, about the strange journey that had brought us all to this point. What Test of Time shows us, I think, is that love really does win over hate, but not in the simple, easy ways we expect. Sometimes love means fighting for truth. Sometimes it means forgiveness. Sometimes it means creating entirely new definitions of what family can look like. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it means all three. Is your family worth fighting for, even when fighting for them means fighting against the version of them you thought you knew? Because that might be the most important question any of us ever answer.